Welcome and good evening. Welcome to the third Jane Lunin Perel Poetry and Fiction Series reading. I am Bruce Graver. I chair the English department at Providence College, and I'm pleased to welcome you this evening to today's celebration of the written word and the work of novelist and poet Russell Banks. He brings distinction to Providence College by his presence here today, and I invite you to join me in a warm greeting. Russell Banks' visit to Providence is something of a homecoming, since he was born in Newton, Mass., and his sister lives on Oriole Lane across town. We are proud to claim him as a New Englander, and we are proud to claim Jane Lunin Perel as friend and colleague. It's Jane's example and her boundless enthusiasm that have made this lecture series both a reality and an annual Providence College highlight. Thank you, Jane. On behalf of the English department, I would also like to thank Dr. Morton Perel for his generosity in establishing this special series. Mort is Jane's most avid supporter. His love and his admiration for Jane's accomplishments inspired him to establish this series, and we are all very grateful. Please join me in expressing our appreciation to Morton Perel. Following this evening's presentation, we'll have a reception and book signing in the lobby. I hope all of you will join us for this. You can see all the good stuff out there, right? To bring greetings from the college leadership and our Dominican community, we've invited Father James Cuddy. A 1998 Providence College graduate, Father Cuddy has served the College of St. Joseph in a number of roles, including several years as PC's chaplain. This past summer, he was named Vice President of Mission and Ministry, and in that role, he oversees the Office of the Chaplain, Campus Ministry, the Center for Dominican Studies, and the chaplaincy to the National Alumni Association. Please welcome Father Cuddy.
Thank you, Dr. Graver. As a member of the class of 1998, Jane and I share something in common here. I almost didn't graduate with my class, so mine was almost an honorary degree too, just as you've honored the college by accepting an honorary degree yourself. I'm very, very happy to be here for a number of different reasons, but first and foremost because, like Morton, I'm a big Jane Perel fan. And it's an honor to be able to have any part of any event that has to do with you. I'm very grateful and want to express my own appreciation here for all who have worked so hard to organize this wonderful event because, as you all know, here at Providence College, we celebrate creativity, originality, and beauty, all of which are revealed to us in a particular way in artistic expression. That's really the reason we gather together tonight to celebrate. And I can think of no one in our community who exemplifies those characteristics more than Jane Lunin Perel. Now, I was not smart enough as a student to have enrolled for every class that I possibly could have, but I have long been a fan of her work and an admirer of her service to the college she loves so much. This is, in Jane, we have an example of the best of Providence College. The PC treasure. And this series is a fitting tribute to decades of immeasurable impact. Many of you know that Jane is a leader beyond compare because beyond the classroom where she directed the English department's poetry and fiction series for 4 decades, she also went in stroke of visionary leadership, founded the college's Women's Studies program in 1994, serving as its first director and the driving force behind its growth and development. And the impact of that work alone would assure an enduring legacy But when all Jane's accomplishments are considered together, it's true, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that she is one of the most significant figures the second half of Providence College's first century and the beginning of its second. This notion is confirmed by the college's decision to accord her an honorary doctorate in 2015, where we see, in a case like that, the college wants to honor Jane, but Jane is the one who is affording the honor to the college by accepting it. It's Jane who honors the college by her continuous contribution and inspiration to the community. The college gave her an honorary degree, but Jane honors us every day. Her example reminds us that we come to fully understand our humanity through the arts. And so to all of you here, your presence today suggests you agree. Jane's pointed out that imagination is a gift of creation, inspiring us to work toward a higher purpose. It's a wonderful insight of great value to our students and to all of us as we fully consider the pursuit of truth in the context of our academic and faith community. Again, I deeply appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today, especially you, Jane and Morton. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Professor Chard Denord, who will introduce our guest tonight, Mr. Banks. Thank you.
I would like to start also by thanking Jane and Mort, Jane, my colleague, for nearly 20 years, who has inspired me and has created a legacy here that will continue and persevere, I know, in her students and as well as in the faculty who learned from her example. It gives me great pleasure tonight, too, and it's a great honor for me to welcome one of America's literary giants to you, the novelist, essayist, poet, Russell Banks. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to his wife, Chase Twitchell, who's out here somewhere, one of America's finest poets. Russell was born in Newton, Mass., and grew up in relative poverty in New Hampshire. He was the first in his family to go to college, first to Colgate and then University of North Carolina, where he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. Influenced initially more by a poet, Walt Whitman, than fiction writers, Russell started out as a poet, publishing Waiting to Freeze in 1969, and then the collection Snow, Meditations of a Cautious Man in Winter in 1974. Citing Walt Whitman as his primary influence as a writer, in a 1989 New York Times interview, Russell commented, "Reading Whitman, particularly Song of Myself, made me see the writer as a mythic poet and liberating figure who was a voice of the people without any class affiliation," end of quote. Russell turned his Whitman-like sensibility to fiction in 1975 when he published his first collection of short stories titled Family Life. The novels and short stories that followed comprise a torrent of powerful, award-winning novels and short fiction that chronicle one dramatic drama of American life after another, prompting Helen Schulman to claim in the New York Times, "Banks may be the most compassionate fiction writer working today." Russell's novels and books of short fiction abound. They include Hamilton, Stark, The Book of Jamaica, The Angel on the Roof, Continental Drift, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, Affliction, The Sweet Hereafter, Rule of the Bone, Cloud Splitter, also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, The Darling, The Reserve, Lost Memory of Skin, Searching for Survivors, The New World, Trailer Park, Success Stories, and A Permanent Member of the Family. In 2017, Russell published a book of travel essays titled Voyager. His novels Affliction and The Sweet Hereafter were made into award-winning films. James Coburn won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in Affliction, and The Sweet Hereafter won the Grand Prix Prize at the Cannes Film Festival. It was also named one of the top 10 movies of all time in Canada. Russell is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the John Dos Passos Prize, the Carnegie Mellon for Excellence in Fiction, the American Book Award, and the Commonwealth Award of Literature, among many more. In 2011, the French Minister of Culture awarded Russell the rank of Officer of Arts and Letters, a huge honor, and from 2004 to 2006, he served as the New York State author, and in 2014, he was inducted into the New York State Hall of Fame, Writers Hall of Fame. His work has been translated into 20 languages. Yet after all these awards, prizes, and appointments, I can vouch that Russell remains a refreshingly humble man. I should also mention that 2 of Russell's works are being made as I speak into movies, an ambitious 8-part series on the life of John Brown as depicted in his novel Cloud Splitter, which will premiere next fall on Fox FX, and the other Russell story, Snowbirds, which the French director Bernard Tavernier is directing. As an avid fan of Russell's work for several decades, I find it not only immensely entertaining, but profound in ways that few other contemporary American fiction writers have managed to emulate. Russell strikes chords of memorable compassion for his afflicted characters with a rare moral genius that's just as evocative as it is insightful. His authorial self is a transpersonal self that inhabits his characters and narrators with astounding empathy, deftness, wit, lyrical economy, wisdom, perspicacity, patience, and audacity. This may sound a little perverse, but I love being led by Russell through his seemingly impenetrably dark themes of domestic strife, childhood homelessness, drug addiction, endemic racism, dire poverty, heartrending grief, American misprision, catastrophe, and religious fanaticism, only to discover that he's known all along where he's going. And just where the cathartic light ultimately shines, and humor too, in his fraught landscapes. Russell's books leave me wondering not only how he knows so damn much about everything, but also just what human alloy he's made of that insulates him from the heat of his fictive fires, allowing him to write so clearly inside them. Like few other writers writing today, Russell manages to write from inside the fires of his stories with what Yeats believed every great writer must possess, namely a cold eye. Russell possesses such an eye, although he's about as warm a man as you'll ever meet. Russell Banks.
Thank you, Shard. That's such a generous introduction. I'm very touched. I'm very honored also to be here this evening, and I too want to thank Dr. Perel and Jane Perel, who are the sponsors, enablers of this series, and I also want to thank Father Cuddy for his remarks and for the invitation to be here. I'd like to read 2 very short stories, and then I think we're going to have some questions and something which will approximate answers but won't really be answers. But these are 2 stories. One is about maybe 20 minutes, and the other is about 10 minutes. So I only require a little of your attention. The first story is called Cow Cow. Cow-cow. We were living in the same double wide up on Spruce Hill as we had since before we got married, before we had any kids even. And this one night last August, me and Larry are heading home from the Spread Eagle, not shit-faced, but pretty buzzed, lifted a little, I guess you could say, which was a fairly typical condition for us then. It's only been not quite a year, and I'm completely aware that I could get back there in a minute if I wasn't watching myself. Larry, I can't speak for, not anymore. His drinking is his problem now. Mine is mine. So we're just pulling into the driveway in Larry's old bucket of rust Taurus. He's driving, and I'm enjoying the view, so to speak, as there was an almost full moon, and the woods and fields and the roofs of the houses and barns were covered with a silver-gray light like frost, when Larry says, "Shit, the cow's out." This was not a small thing, nor was it a thing that hadn't happened to us numerous times already, especially with that particular cow. We raise and butcher all our meat, or we used to. And there are bears up there on Spruce Hill and wild dogs, which I did not especially want to see eat our cow before we did. Besides, cows can get into all kinds of trouble on their own, break their legs on old fencing, or fall down an open well or quarry, and by the time you got to it, it'd be dead and rotted and useless to butcher for meat. She wasn't a fancy cow, a Hereford or Black Angus or something, just a cow. But she was important to us, as we never had much for cash income except summers when Larry could get work house painting or the odd job that came his way from the tourist industry, from summer people and such. Come winter, that cow was food on the table for us and the kids. Protein was how I looked at her, and consequently, since we only raised one at a time, Protein was the name I gave our cows, so as not to get too attached to the beast. So as not to forget the reason for its existence, I explained to the kids. Although it didn't really work for them. They always ended up thinking of the cow as a member of the family. To them, Protein was a word like any other and could be turned into a name as easily as Bossy or Elsie, or my name even, or Larry's. For that reason, we butchered our animals only on days when the kids were in school or up to my mother's or sleeping over at a friend's house, to spare them the actual dispatching and final departure of the cow. If the kids didn't have to watch it in person, they had no problem with killing animals and butchering them, and they could talk about how they missed old Protein even as they sat at the table chewing on one of her steaks. Kids are like that. They can hold contrary opinions or opposite feelings in their heads without the slightest sense of illogic. The barnyard gate was wide open, which is how Larry knew the cow was out. Typically in a hurry to get to the spread eagle, he'd probably neglected to latch it after he fed and watered her. I'd been inside putting the kids down. "Hold your horses, for Christ's sake, I'm coming," I told him when I got into the car. "Just 'cause it's still light out doesn't mean it ain't late," he grumbled. "No, Larry, it doesn't," I said, and sighed so he could notice. "It certainly does not." I don't think I was any more pissed at Larry than usual, but it did feel different to me that night. Heavier, somehow, like the force of gravity was dragging my feelings to the ground and staking them there. Although I didn't pay any heed to it at the time, I'd gotten used to him long ago. Larry's not a bad man, not as such, anyhow. And he wasn't behaving that night any differently than the way he always behaved. Impatient, distracted, self-centered, and critical. That was Larry for as long as I'd known him. But sentimental, too, and for a man, weepy. Sorrowful is a word I would use. I think that's what kept me around so long, his sorrow. And I think he knew it. I went into the house to check on the kids while Larry went to the barn, and in the moonlight, too late now, closed the gate. I watched him from the window of the darkened kitchen. He made sure this time that it was latched. He moved slowly and deliberately, as if he needed to keep telling himself where he was and what he was doing there, the movements of a drunk man. The kids were all in bed asleep, except for Lydia, who was watching Letterman and had to be reminded that she had school tomorrow. "So get the hell to bed right now," I said, and she skulked off, angry and wounded the way only a 13-year-old girl can. Larry hit the car horn a couple times, and I went out to shut him up so the kids wouldn't wake. He had the motor running, and the car turned around in the driveway, heading out. "Where are you going?" I asked him. "The cemetery." She's probably gone there again, same as last time. Cows are stupid. They keep going back to the same place they got caught last time. Get in, he said. It's dark. I'll need you to shine the headlights while I catch her. You bring a bucket of grain? Yes, I brought a bucket of grain. Flashlight? He didn't answer. I got into the car beside him. What about your gun? You got your gun? No. Why? Get your gun, Larry. Jesus. Why? To shoot her, for Christ's sake. Get your gun. Get your fucking gun. I don't know why I was hollering, but I was. He got out of the car and went into the house and came back a minute later with his 12 gauge. I don't see the point of shooting her, he said, laying the gun on the back seat. You need to shoot her, Larry, because you keep forgetting to latch the gate, and she'll be back down there tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, until the Board of Selectmen finally decides to shoot her themselves. And we'll be out 500 pounds of beef this winter, Larry. Our freezer will be empty, I said through gritted teeth. Don't you get it? He mumbled something that I took to be a concession and drove out to the road, turned left, and headed down the mile-long hill to the bottom, where we turned onto the narrow, unpaved lane that leads to the town cemetery. The moon had dropped behind the mountains now, and it was pitch dark. It was spooky, in a way, being in a cemetery at night like this. The headlights carved out some space in front of the car, but everything else was lost in blackness, until suddenly a leafy tree branch would drop in front of the windshield, or a tombstone loomed up beside the car. We're never going to find her here this late, Larry said. I'm thinking we should wait for daylight. He was dead tired and still feeling the booze, I knew, and so was I, but no way was I going to let that cow wander around all night, I told him. Who knows where she'll be by morning? She could easily stroll from the cemetery onto Spruce Hill Road and get creamed by a semi hauling logs to Montreal. She could fall into the river and drown. Either way, she'd end up useless to us, I told him. A total lost cow. Larry says, Katie, is that her? He stops the car, backs it up a few feet, and half turns it off the road, so the headlights splash light uphill a distant ways into the graveyard. There's all kinds of gravestones up there, casting these huge, long shadows against the grass and across the gravestones behind them. And here comes the cow, Protein, meandering her way between the granite stones and grave markers, munching on the fresh, dew-wet grass as she goes, swinging and swaying her big bony hips, and totally ignoring us like she's exactly where she belongs, and we're not. She's nearly full grown, but still a heifer with big black and white splotches across her back and haunches, and a mostly white head. I can see why she likes it here. The grass is thick and bright green and plentiful compared to the grass at our place. Also, there's flowers that people have put on the graves, and she's eating them as well as the grass. It's peaceful here, unmolested and quiet, except for the occasional diesel moan of a truck climbing Spruce Hill on its way to the Northway and beyond. If I was a cow and somebody left my gate unhitched, this is where I'd be too. Larry got out and told me to keep the lights on her. Then he opened the trunk and took out the bucket of grain. I slid into the driver's seat. The cow strolled slowly into the light when for the first time she looked up at us. Holding the bucket like it was a peace offering, Larry walked tippy-toe toward her. Come on, girl. Come and get your supper, he sort of sang to her. Supper, girl, supper. She ignored him and went back to munching on the abundant graveyard grass. Larry tried a few minutes longer to get her attention, but she wouldn't even raise her head. Finally, he returned to the car, and I rolled down the window. What? I said. I can't get her to eat from the bucket. Try setting it on the ground out there in front of the car a ways and then step back into the shadows. Try that, I said. He did as instructed, and after a while, 10 minutes maybe, during which time I smoked a cigarette and Larry stood in the dark next to the car watching silently, the cow at last edged up to the bucket and stuck her snout into it and began eating the grain. Get the gun, I said to him. What? Larry, get the damn gun. He came over to the car, opened the rear door, and took out his 12 gauge. I don't need the damn gun, he said. Then he carried it into the glare of the headlights and stood next to the cow. Shoot her, Larry. He didn't say or do anything, just stood there slump-shouldered with the gun in his right hand, watching the cow chomp away on the grain in the bucket. Finally, she pulled her head from the pail, slurped her lips with her thick gray tongue, and looked at Larry as if to thank him. Shoot her, for Christ's sake. Why? Because we don't have any more grain. Because I want you to. I don't know. Shoot the damn cow, Larry. Just shoot her. He lifted the bucket as if to check it for grain one last time, and the cow again stuck her muzzle into it. All gone, Larry said to the cow. Nothing left. Then he brought the barrel of the shotgun up and placed it next to the hard, flat forehead of the cow and fired. I jumped at the sound as if I hadn't expected it. Yet I had expected it. I'd been calling for it. But it was as if I had been calling from a dream. Her eyes bulged in astonishment and rolled back, and blood spurted from her head. Her forelegs buckled at the knees. And she fell forward and flopped onto her side and was absolutely still. She seemed enormous then, bigger than the car. Blood poured from the large hole in her head onto the dewy grass. The light splashed over the body of the cow and the spreading puddle of blood and the grass. What do we do now? Larry said. I didn't have a clue, but I said, your trouble is you just think one step at a time. You're the one wanted her dead. He got into the car on the passenger side and lit a cigarette. Shut the motor and lights off, he said. We don't need them now. I complied, and we sat there in the total dark for a while, smoking and not saying anything. It was almost like the cow wasn't there, like she was still up in the barn at our place, and Larry and I were sitting here in the car in the dark, talking in low voices about the future. We need a front loader, Larry said. We can't leave her here. The dogs or a bear will get into her. He was right. So I started the car again, and while Larry stayed behind with the flashlight and his gun and guarded the cow, I drove into the village. By this time it was very late, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, not a car in the road, not a light. I knew whoever I called would be asleep, but at that moment it didn't seem like I had a choice. I pulled up beside the payphone at Chick Lawrence's garage and got out and dialed Wade Whitney first, since he and Larry are old hunting buddies. But Wade said no. His front loader was up on Adrian's Acres where he was digging a cellar. Then I tried Randy LeClaire, but all I got was an answering machine. I was trying to remember who else in town owned a front loader when I looked beyond the gas pumps and saw in the shadows exactly what I was looking for. Chick Lawrence had a loader. Because he used it mainly for snow removal, not excavation, I'd forgotten it existed. His house was next door to his garage, so all I had to do was walk up to it and knock, which I did. Chick's a friendly guy and neighborly. He came to the door in his underwear, worried-looking, expecting an emergency probably, a car wreck or something, as he's got the only tow truck in town. He seemed to relax when I explained our fix. Well, okay, he said. I'll meet you over to the cemetery in 15 minutes or so, he said. It sure is a nice night, he said, looking up at the starry sky. Then he laughed like he'd told a little joke. That's a mannerism of his. I drove back to the cemetery, and with the headlights of the car and a tap on the horn, woke up Larry, who had fallen asleep against one of the tombstones. He stood and strolled over to the car, snapping his flashlight. "Batteries are dead," he said, as if that explained everything. The cow was still there, a huge black and white mound surrounded by a spreading puddle of blood. "Watch where you walk," I said, just as he was about to step in the blood. Then I told him Chick Lawrence was coming right over, and he seemed visibly relieved and leaned against the fender and smoked a cigarette and studied the stars. I kept the motor running and the lights on and stared straight out over the hood at that damned cow. I don't know why, but at that moment I despised that poor animal. It was like she had done something unforgivable and had done it to me personally. It wasn't just the alcohol, which had pretty much worn off by then. There was lots about that night that I didn't understand. My telling Larry to bring the gun, for instance, and then hollering for him to shoot the cow. And I didn't understand how it had come to this, to sitting around in a graveyard in the middle of the night waiting for Chick Lawrence to show up with his front loader so we can haul a dead cow back up the hill to our place. I wanted to blame Larry, but I couldn't. All he'd done was whatever I'd asked him to do, from the beginning, from when we first met in high school and started screwing in the back seat of his old Camaro, right up to tonight, 14 years later. Larry always did what I asked him to. The problem I was beginning to see lay in the asking. "Larry," I said, "this is one of the lousiest nights of my life. And what's worse, it's typical." "Typical?" He paused. "That's what this is to you?" "Yes." "That's what I was afraid of," he said. And that was the end of it. About 20 minutes later, here comes Chick in his big yellow front loader looking like some kind of prehistoric dinosaur with its head-high tires and great wide-open mouth and its headlights like gigantic bug eyes flopping up and down as the vehicle made its slow, noisy way along the lane from the main road. He drew the loader up to the cow and cut the motor back to idle. He leaned out of the cab and called down, "How'd you come to shoot your cow here at the cemetery?" Larry shrugged his shoulders. "I guess one thing just led to another." "I guess the hell it did," Chick said, and gave his little laugh. He backed the front loader off a few feet and dropped the bucket to the ground, then came forward very slowly and with a surprising tenderness got the lower lip of the bucket underneath the cow. Gently he scooped the poor beast off the ground and lifted it almost like a parent picking up a sleeping child. The body of the cow rolled heavily into the bucket and over onto its back so that it ended with all four of its legs sticking up in the air. It made a weird, almost comical sight as Chick lifted the bucket into the air, backed around, and headed slowly away from the cemetery toward the main road. Larry got in beside me, and I drove the Taurus behind Chick, turned left at the road, and followed him up the long stretch of Spruce Hill Road to our place. There were no other cars or trucks out at that hour, which is a good thing because we were a peculiar, slow-moving, suspicious-looking procession. The loader was making about 10 miles an hour at best, and from my position behind it, I could see around the cab and catch glimpses of the cow's spindly legs and hoofs sticking out of the bucket, which Chick kept pretty high in the air to keep the vehicle balanced and its rear wheels on the ground. Whenever the vehicle crossed a ripple or dip in the paving, the bucket bounced some, and the cow seemed almost to be alive then and struggling like it was prey to get loose of this monstrous mouth. Finally, we got to the top of the hill and turned off the road onto our driveway. I glanced behind us and saw that the eastern sky was turning pink and pale blue. It was going to be a nice day. Chick stopped the loader and called down to us, "Where do you want me to put her?" Larry checked me, and I checked him back. We both wanted the other to answer Chick's question. Larry's eyes were sunk into his face and bloodshot, and his cheeks had gone all saggy, and he needed a shave. He looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him before. I must have looked the same to him. He exhaled through pursed lips, a silent whistle, and said, "Oh, Jesus, Cuddy. It's over then, isn't it? We got to let it go, Larry. Do we have to? Can't we just do like before, like we've always done?" I leaned out the car window and hollered up to Chick, "Drop her on the dock in front of the barn where the winch and chain are. We'll hang her up and butcher her there in a few minutes." He said, "Fine," and I thanked him. "Good night," he said to me. Then he laughed, "Or good morning," and dropped the loader into gear and headed it in the direction of the barn. I turned back to Larry. "We better cut up that cow," I said, "before it starts to spoil." "I'll do it," he said, and he got out of the car. I got out too, and we stood there looking at each other over the roof of the old Taurus. "Cuddy, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't do things a different way and better. I'm sorry about the drinking, too. I know you are. I am, too. How come it happened tonight? Larry, I don't know." We were silent for a moment. "It could have been any night," I said. "Could be it happened a long time ago, only we didn't know it then. Like one of those stars that flare up and die, and you don't see it happening until years later because it's so far away. Maybe it's better we didn't see it when it happened," he said. "Maybe it's more peaceful this way. I don't know. You go on inside, Cuddy, and get some sleep. I'll butcher the cow." He gave me a little wave and trudged down the driveway toward the barn. Dawn was coming on fast now, and I could see him in the pale gray light all the way to the barn. For a while I stood there by the front door of the house and continued to watch him. He hooked the chain onto the cow's hind legs just above the hoofs. Then he slowly hoisted the animal off the ground, and soon she was clear of the ground altogether and dangling heavily above the loading dock. He clipped the end of the chain into a ring bolted to the dock. When he disappeared into the barn, going to get his knives, I went into the house to check the kids and to sleep. That same afternoon, he moved out. Now something a little more upbeat. Story called The Moor. This is shorter as well. Different kind of narrator here. One thing, a man. The Moor. It's about 10 p.m., and I'm one of three face-it middle-aged guys crossing South Main Street in light snow, headed for a quick drink at the Greeks. We've just finished a 32nd degree induction ceremony at the Masonic Hall in the old Capitol Theater building and need a blow. I'm the tall figure in the middle, Warren Lowe, and I guess it's my story I'm telling, although you could say it was Gail Fortunata's story, since meeting her that night after half a lifetime is what got me started. I'm wearing remnants of makeup from the ceremony in which I portrayed an Arab prince. Red lips, streaks of black on my face here and there, not quite washed off because of no cold cream at the hall. The guys tease me about what a terrific nigger I make. That's the way they talk. And I try to deflect their teasing by ignoring it because I'm not as prejudiced as they are, even though I'm pleased nonetheless. It's an acting job, the 32nd degree. And not many guys are good at it. We are friends and businessmen, colleagues. I sell plumbing and heating supplies. My friend Sammy Gibson is in real estate, and the other, Rick Buckingham, is a Chevy dealer. We enter the Greek's, a small restaurant and fern bar, pass through the dining room into the bar and back like regulars, because we are regulars and like making a point of it, greeting the Greek and his help. Small comforts. Sammy and Rick hit uselessly on one of the waitresses, the pretty little blonde kid, and make a crack or two about the new gay waiter who's in the far corner by the kitchen door and can't hear them. Wise guys. The Greek says to me, "What's with the grease paint?" "Theater group," I tell him. He's not a Mason. I think he's Orthodox Catholic or something, but he knows what we do. As we pass one table in particular, this elderly lady in the group looks me straight in the eyes, which gets my attention because otherwise she's just some old lady. Then for a split second, I think I know her, but decide not and keep going. She's a large, baggy, bright-eyed woman in her late 70s, possibly early 80s, old. Sammy, Rick, and I belly up to the bar, order drinks, the usuals, comment on the snow outside, and feel safe and contented in each other's company. We reflect on our wives and ex-wives and our grown kids, all elsewhere. We're out late and guilt-free. I peek around the divide at her. Thin, silver blue hair, dewlaps at her throat, liver spots on her long, flat cheeks. What the hell, an old lady. She's with family, some kind of celebration, 2 sons. They look like in their 40s with their wives and a bored teenage girl, all 5 of them overweight, dull, dutiful, in contrast to the old woman who, despite her age, looks smart, aware, all dressed up in a maroon knit wool suit. Clearly an attractive woman once. I drift from Sammy and Rick, ask the Greek, "Who's the old lady? What's the occasion?" The Greek knows her son's name, Italian, Fortunata, he thinks. Doesn't register, I say. No comprendo. "The old lady's 80th, says the Greek. "We should live so long, right? You know her?" "No, I guess not." The waitresses and the gay waiter sing happy birthday, making a scene, but the place is almost empty anyhow from the snow, and everybody seems to like it, and the old lady smiles serenely. I say to Sammy and Rick, "I think I know the old gal from someplace, but can't remember where." "Customers," says Sammy, munching peanuts. Rick says the same. "Customer." And they go on, as before. "Probably an old girlfriend," Sammy adds. "Ha ha," I say back. A Celtics-Knicks game on TV has their attention, double overtime. Finally, the Knicks win, and it's time to go home, guys. Snow's piling up. We pull on our coats, pay the bartender, and as we leave, the old lady's party is also getting ready to go. And when I pass their table, she catches my sleeve, says my name, says it with a question mark. "Warren? Warren Lowe?" I say, "Yeah, hi," and smile, but still I don't remember her. Then she says, "I'm Gail Fortunata, Warren. I knew you years ago," she says, and smiles fondly. And then everything comes back, or almost everything. "Do you remember me?" she asks. Sure I do. Of course I do. Gail, how've you been? Geez, it's sure been a while." She nods, still smiling. "What's that on your face? Makeup?" "Yeah, been doing a little theater. Didn't have any cold cream to get it off," I say lamely. She says, "I'm glad you're still acting." And then she introduces me to her family, like that. "This is my family." "Howdy," I say, and start to introduce my friends Sammy and Rick, but they're already at the door. Sammy says, "S'long, Warren. Don't do anything I wouldn't do." And Rick gives a wave, and they're out. "So it's your birthday, Gail. Happy birthday." She says, "Why, thank you." The others are all standing now, pulling on their coats, except for Gail, who still hasn't let go of my sleeve, which she tugs, and then says to me, "Sit down a minute, Warren. I haven't seen you in, 30 years? Imagine." "Ma," the son says, "it's late. The snow." I draw up a chair next to Gail, and letting go of the dumb pretenses, I suddenly find myself struggling to see in her eyes the woman I knew for a few months when I was a kid, barely 21, and she was almost 50 and married, and these 2 fat guys were her skinny teenage sons. But I can't see through the old lady's face to the woman she was then. If that woman is gone, then so is the boy, this boy. She looks up at one of her sons and says, Dickie, you go without me. Warren will give me a ride. Won't you, Warren? She says, turning to me. I'm staying at Dickie's house up on the heights. That's not out of your way, is it? No, I'm up on the heights too, Alton Woods. Just moved into a condo there. Dickie says, fine, a little worried. He looks like he's used to losing arguments with his mother. They all give her a kiss on the cheek, wish her a happy birthday again, and file out into the snow. A plow scrapes past on the street. Otherwise, no traffic. The Greek and his crew start cleaning up while Gail and I talk a few minutes more. Although her eyes are wet and red-rimmed, she's not teary, she's smiling. It's as if there are translucent shells over her bright blue eyes. Even so, now when I look hard, I can glimpse her the way she was, slipping around back there in the shadows. She had heavy, dark red hair, clear white skin, smooth as porcelain, broad shoulders, and she was tall for a woman, almost as tall as I was. I remember exactly from when she and her husband once took me along with them to a VFW party, and she and I danced while he played cards. You've turned into a handsome man, Warren, she says. Then she gives a little laugh. Still a handsome man, I mean. Nah, gone to seed. You're only young once, I guess. When we knew each other, Warren, I was the age you are now. Yeah, I guess that's so. Strange to think about, isn't it? Are you divorced? You look like it. Yeah, divorced. A couple of years now, kids, 3 girls, all grown up. I'm even a grandpa. It was not one of your happy marriages, not by a long shot. I don't think I want to hear about all that. Okay, what do you want to hear about? Let's have one drink and one short talk for old time's sake. Then you may drive me to my son's house. I say fine and ask the Greek who's at the register tapping out if it's too late for a nightcap. He shrugs, why not? And Gail asks for a sherry and I order the usual vodka and tonic. The Greek scoots back to the bar, pours the drinks himself because the bartender is wiping down the cooler, and returns and sets them down before us. On the house, he says, and goes back to counting the night's take. It's odd, isn't it, that we never ran into each other before this, she says. All these years, you came up here to Concord, and I stayed there in Portsmouth, even after the boys left. Frank's job was there. Yeah, well, I guess 50 miles is a long ways sometimes. How is Frank? I ask, realizing as soon as I say it that he was at least 10 years older than she. He died. Frank died in 1982. Oh, geez, I'm sorry to hear that. I want to ask you something, Warren. I hope you won't mind if I speak personally with you. No, shoot. I take a belt from my drink. I never dared to ask you then. It would have embarrassed you then, I thought, because you were so scared of what we were doing together, so unsure of yourself. Yeah, no kidding. I was, 21, and you were, well, not scary, but let's say impressive, married, with kids, a sophisticated woman of the world, you seemed to me, and I was this apprentice plumber working on my first job away from home, a kid. No, you were more than that, Warren. That's why I took to you so easily. You were very sensitive. I thought someday you'd become a famous actor. I wanted to encourage you. You did. I laughed nervously because I don't know where this conversation is going, and take another pull from my drink and say, I've done lots of acting over the years, all local stuff, some of it pretty serious, no big deal, but I kept it up. I don't do much nowadays, of course, but you did encourage me, Gail, you did, and I'm truly grateful for that. She sips her sherry with pursed lips like a bird. Good, she says. Warren, were you a virgin then when you met me? Oh, geez. Well, that's quite a question, isn't it? I laugh. Is that what you've been wondering all these years? Were you the first woman I ever made love with? Wow, Hey, Gail, I don't think anybody's ever asked me that before. And here we are, 30 years later. I'm smiling at her, but the air is rushing out of me. I just want to know, dear. You never said it one way or the other. We shared a big secret, but we never really talked about our own secrets. We talked about the theater. We had our little love affair, and then you went on, and I stayed with Frank and grew old. Older. You weren't old. As old as you are now, Warren. Yeah, but I'm not old. Well, were you? What? A virgin? You don't have to answer if it embarrasses you. I hold off a few seconds. The waitress and the new kid and the bartender have all left, and only the Greek is here perched on a stool in the bar watching Nightline. I could tell her the truth, or I could lie, or I could beg off the question altogether. It's hard to know what's right. Finally, I say, yes, I was. I was a virgin when I met you. It was the first time for me, I tell her, and she sits back in her chair and looks me full in the face and smiles as if I've just given her the perfect birthday gift, the one no one else thought she wanted, the gift she never dared ask for. It's a beautiful smile, grateful and proud, and seems to go all the way back to the day we first met. She reaches over and places her small, crackled hand on mine. She says, I never knew for sure. But whenever I think back on those days and remember how we used to meet in your room, I always pretend that for you it was the first time. I even pretended it back then when it was happening. It meant something to me. For a few moments, neither of us speaks. Then I break the spell. What do you say we shove off? They need to close this place up, and the snow's coming down hard. She agrees, and I help her slide into her coat. My car's parked only halfway down the block, but it's a slow walk to it because the sidewalk is a little slippery, and she's very careful. When we're in the car and moving north on Main Street, we remain silent for a while, and finally I say to her, you know, Gail, there's something I've wondered all these years myself. Is there? Yeah, but you don't have to tell me if it embarrasses you. Warren, dear, you reach a certain age, nothing embarrasses you. Yeah, well, I guess that's true. What is it? Okay, I wondered if, except for me, you stayed faithful to Frank and before me. No hesitation. She says, yes, I was faithful to Frank before you and after. Except for my husband, you were the only man I loved. I don't believe her, but I know why she has lied to me. This time it's my turn to smile and reach over and place my hand on hers. The rest of the way we don't talk, except for her giving me directions to her son's house, which is a plain brick ranch on a curving side street up by the old armory. The porch light is on, but the rest of the house is dark. It's late, I say to her. So it is. I get out and come around and help her from the car and then walk her up the path to the door. She gets her key from her purse and unlocks the door and turns around and looks up at me. She's not as tall as she used to be. I'm very happy that we saw each other tonight, she says. We probably won't see each other again. Well, we can if you want to. You're still a very sweet man, Warren. I'm glad of that. I wasn't wrong about you. I don't know what to say. I want to kiss her, though, and I do. I lean down and put my arms around her and kiss her on the lips, very gently, then a little more, and she kisses me back with just enough pressure against me to let me know that she is remembering everything, too. We hold each other like that for a long time. Then I step away. She turns, opens the door, and takes one last look back at me. She smiles. You've still got makeup on, she says. What's the play? I forgot to ask. Oh, I say, thinking fast because I'm remembering that she's Catholic and probably doesn't think much of the Masons. Othello, I say. That's nice. And you're the Moor? Yes. Still smiling, She gives me a slow pushing wave with her hand as if dismissing me and goes inside. When the door is closed behind her, I want to stand there alone on the steps all night with the snow falling around my head in clouds and watch it fill our tracks on the path. But it actually is late, and I have to work tomorrow, so I leave. Driving home, it's all I can do to keep from crying. Time's come, time's gone. Time's never returning, I say to myself. What's here in front of me is all I've got, I decide, and as I drive my car through the blowing snow, it doesn't seem like much, except for the kindness that I've just exchanged with an old lady.
Hello.
Okay, thank you.
We have time for a few questions. I'm going to ask Russell a few questions, and then I'm going to open it up for a few questions from folks in the audience. So maybe just to start with here, it's really impossible to know just where to begin with you. You've written so much. You've chronicled American life from the early 80s up until the present, and nailed pretty much the zeitgeist of pretty much of every decade. I'm wondering what you're feeling now about the work, about your next project, about what it's like writing right now in 2018. I know you're working on a new novel now, but you know.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's actually an almost impossible question to answer because you've left out half the equation. What's it like to be writing at the age I am at, which is 78, and then now at this time, because it would be very different if I were 28 or 38, 48, even 58 and 68 than where I am now. So those are the two elements in the possible way of answering the question. It's very different in as much as the kind of work that I was doing when I was younger was much more a way of inventing myself as an adult in the larger world than it is now, obviously. And so much of the kind of writing that I do now is almost without will, without any impulse behind it. It's a momentum established over 50 years or so that is almost like, it's not probably fortunately, but it's not perpetual, but it keeps on going nonetheless. And so that drives me. I don't really think too hard about what it's like to write in the world today. I've always concentrated from the very beginning on the lives of individual people, individual human beings, and tried to penetrate in some way the mystery of their subjective experience of the world. And in as much as I have moved through the world they've moved through, then that's my only kind of way into it. It's a hard question to answer, in as much as I, like most any novelist or any artist, am not trying to write about the world today. I'm trying to write about human beings who live in the world today, I suppose. But I mean, those two stories that I read tonight are from different periods in my life. One is about 10 years old and one is about 20 years old. But they feel to me, as I'm reading them, that they're in the world today as much as anything I might set out to write today. I have no way of making a distinction between the world that I tried to write in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and the world I try to write in today. I think, it's one thing, it's interesting, obviously I'm working on a novel, and part of it's set in the late 60s, and part of it's set in 2018. In the late 60s part, there are no cell phones and no internet in the contemporary by, yes, there are. Technology has changed, and then the people who are, that's part of their context, and so they're relating to it. But that's not a different. Human beings, was it Eudora Welty said, a human emotion doesn't change, only context.
Great. This audience is filled with young people who are reading and novels and other, of course, other books. We live in a time when this president says he doesn't read. And we live in a very anti-intellectual time in many ways as far as the politics right now. What would you say to students out there who are reading fiction, who need to read fiction in order to find truth in stories that are made up?
Well, I've said this before in different formats and different ways, but I think it's important to recall that we are the only creature that doesn't know on this planet, really, that doesn't know what it is to be itself and has to learn over and over and over again what it is to be human. And how do we do that? What it is to be human in all the different ways we are human. And I think that we do this through the representations of human beings in art, through story and narrative, and all the forms that it takes, through poetry, theater, film. But storytelling primarily, for me at least, is how we learn again, once again, to be human in that universal way. So reading, therefore, is really about trying to find out what it is to be a human being, for better or worse. The angelic as well as the demonic. That's human, both of them. And to begin, I suppose we have to begin to justify that activity that it requires, the energy that it requires and time. We have to admit that we don't really know what it is to be human. To start there. Maybe that's what if I were teaching, maybe that's where I would start, is to say, you know, you don't know what it is to be human. I don't know what it is to be human. I have to be constantly learning what it is to be human. And it's just simply that. And here's a place where you can go and find out. Read the stories, as we were speaking earlier, of Flannery O'Connor. You want to know what it's like to be human? Read that. Read Dostoevsky. You want to know what it's like to be human? That's what it's like to be human. And you are one too. So I don't know if that would going to get anybody galloping out to the bookstore, but
this is a very exciting time for you because two of your works are being made into big films. Your book Cloud Splitter, which is about John Brown, a monumental book, that's both historical and imaginative, and also your short story Snowbirds about a widow in Florida. Could you talk first a little bit about what's about this movie Cloud Splitter that's going to be made into an 8-part film that Fox is going to do next year, and why the story of John Brown, who was instrumental in sparking the Civil War, of course, is so important to see right now?
Well, it's really in the idea of adapting it to television, really, and to bringing it into the domestic life of the viewers, to their living rooms and all, is very attractive in a way for a novelist or for someone who has a story like that. But it's also at the same time very important to me as a writer. Not that it's a translation of the novel in any way whatsoever, but that one or two of the perspectives of the novel are kept intact in any adaptation, film adaptation. And there are many ways you could approach that novel. You could approach it as a story about race, or as a story about the cataclysmic events that eventually created the Civil War. You could make it a story about a father and a son, a family story about John Brown and his son. It's narrated by the son. You could make it about religion. You could make it about political violence. But for me, it was always essentially and narrowly at bottom the story of the making of a terrorist, because Brown was a terrorist. He was many things. You might call him a good terrorist. After all, he was committing acts of terrorism in order to end slavery, but he was a terrorist nonetheless. And his sons became a terrorist with him, alongside him. So the story is really, how did that son become a terrorist? And that was essential to me in the adaptation. The thing that happens with adaptation of fiction to film, inevitably, especially a novel going to film, is that you throw away 90% of it, or at least, and sometimes more, and only preserve the pieces of the novel that you think will make, if you're the filmmaker, will make a good film. Not what it's bad for a filmmaker to be too loyal to the novel, in fact. And I think in this case, because it's being adapted to 8-hour series, you can be much more faithful to the novel than you can if you're doing a 2-hour film. I never wanted it to be adapted in a 2-hour film at all. That would have been,
Yeah, Scorsese wanted to make it into a 2-hour film, and you said you're one of the few people I know who said no to Scorsese.
Well, it was mutual.
All right, I think we have one question here from this fellow over here. This is Colin Channer, who is a wonderful writer himself. Many people refer to him as the Bob Marley with a pen, who's from Jamaica and a good friend of Russell's, and he wants to ask him a question.
I have a question for you, Russell, which is, you spend a good amount of time in the Caribbean. You've written about the Caribbean quite a bit. I'm thinking of Continental Drift, which concerns Haiti, the Bahamas, as well as Miami, the Book of Jamaica, of course, and also
Rule of the Bone.
Rule of the Bone.
Yeah.
Right, which is in many ways a reimagining of some of the parts of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Can you talk about how being in the Caribbean informed the way in which you seem to have a kind of new world scope to the way in which you look at the characters in your stories?
Yeah, the impact of the Caribbean on my imagination was unexpected and not sought. I had been down on holiday to Jamaica and to other places, as most Americans who are able to do, especially those of us who live in the Northeast in the winter. But I hadn't really entered my bloodstream until the middle 70s, and I got a Guggenheim that year, and I got a National Endowment for the Arts Award at the same time. So I suddenly was flush with cash and could go anywhere in the world I wanted to go. And most of my contemporaries who got a Guggenheim or NEA, especially if you got them in the same year, were going to Rome or Florence or exotic European places, and London or Paris and so on. Madrid, and I had had a couple of really good times in Jamaica, and so I said, let's go to Jamaica instead. Spent my Guggenheim in Jamaica, and so we did. We rented a house, and my wife and I and our kids, and we settled into a town where we were the only white people in this little village in the country of Jamaica, and I just got drawn into the history of the Caribbean and the history of race in the Western Hemisphere, and began to see from the outside the history of race in the United States, and therefore the history, as Baldwin says, the history of African Americans is the history of white people. And I began to see my own history for the first time in a larger frame, a larger context. And it was a door opening for me, and it took me to a whole other level of understanding of my personal history and my country's history and the relationship between the two. And it's never left me. It's only deepened and broadened over my lifetime since. That was in the middle 70s then. And it was just an accident, really. Circumstantial. I had some money, I had a grant. I didn't want to go to Spain or Paris or Rome. I thought I can get a house real cheap in Jamaica, and so I just wanted to get warm, and like so many Americans, go to Jamaica. But then it turned into something else altogether, and it opened up the world to me. But it isn't that it opened up the world of Jamaica or Haiti or the other parts of the Caribbean. It opened up the world of the United States to me, of North America, because I got to see it for the first time from the outside looking back. I got to be the only white person in a black community and see what that feels like when you are the sharply defined minority. I got to understand so much that I could never have understood otherwise. Not about Jamaicans, there was always mystery there that I never could penetrate all the way through to that, but about myself. And that was the important part of it.
I think we're coming close to an end. I'm getting a signal from the back, so unfortunately we're going to have to end. But thank you so much for coming, everybody, and thank you, Russell.